If Effie didn't tell her story, someone's got to tell her story. She didn't plan any of this career of hers, this Baha'i career, or this career in becoming a historic photographer. It just unfolded because she took the opportunities that were in front of her. My name's Graham Hassall, and I grew up in Sydney. And just by coincidence or by chance, by good fortune, I was part of the Baha'i community in Sydney at the time when Effie Baker was living there in the National Centre, the Baha'i National Centre at Toolang Road, Paddington. So I've grown up with the sound of Effie's voice, her sprightly character. As children, we were always pleased that Effie gave us that attention, that maybe older people were getting on with the affairs of the day and not looking at the children, so Effie was different to that. And I took an interest in Baha'i history while I was doing my studies in other fields, and it quickly became apparent that Effie happened to be one of those people who had an important role in the history of the Australian Baha'i community, which extended into a history of the Baha'i community elsewhere.
So Effie, who was born in 1880, she was sent from Goldsborough to Ballarat to live with her grandparents, with Captain Baker and his wife. She was brought up here, the Ballarat Observatory. The Baker family, you had generations of the family all living here at the observatory.
Her grandfather is known for the telescope at the observatory in Ballarat.
There was nothing to compare with the Baker telescope. It was just such a massive instrument.
He was a captain of a boat, ended up in Victoria during the gold rush, and the story is that he couldn't get enough crew to sail away because everybody went to the goldfields, so he joined them.
He was a master instrument maker. In fact, he won prizes at the great exhibitions in Melbourne. Ballarat is a remarkable cultural city which is having its influence on Effie. She used to love playing around, watching her grandfather while he was tinkering away in his workshop, making various things. Of course, it's the important period when women are just demanding the right to vote. I think the Baker women would have all been very strong in that movement to be equal citizens, which was a very strong movement in the 1890s, leading up to 1902, when Australia was one of the first places in the world to give women the right to vote. It was the end of the 1890s, when Effie was still living here, that she was given her own camera by her aunt Elizabeth, and Elizabeth was a remarkable photographer in her own right. Photography only evolves basically as an indoor medium, particularly. But Elizabeth is getting passionate about photography in around about 1890, and about taking photographs outdoors, but most interestingly, taking astronomical photos. So using the Baker telescope to help her take wonderful photographs of the stars and the constellations. And young Effie, her little niece, while she's at the art gallery school studying painting and drawing, she's learning all about the art of photography from her aunt, and she's putting those skills together beautifully.
She's receiving this encouragement from an older family member who saw her abilities with painting and drawing, and thought she might also be good at this new technology of photography. We've just discovered in the archive the only large painting that I know of that remains of Effie's. It's signed E. Baker, 1896. Effie's born in March of 1880. So this makes it her work as a 16-year-old. And once again, just shows that she's taken this love of colour, the Australian bush, and being an artist.
And then she experiments with taking photos. So she goes out around the area, takes lovely landscape shots.
Which she evidently developed herself, the photographs. Quite adventurous for a young woman to have that skill in place by the age of 18.
She liked to make up albums of photos and then give these as gifts to family members.
Her photographs are not the snapshot of the young person who's merely out with friends. There's a lot of thought put into these compositions. This type of photography to me is reminiscent of Arthur Streeton's work. There's a famous work called Fires on Lapstone Tunnel, and when I see this type of work from Effie, this was taken in the late 1890s, and it's roughly similar to the time of that famous Australian painting. She's really trying to depict the Australian landscape, sailing ship in Port Adelaide. This is a picnic at Moorabool. It reminds one of Picnic at Hanging Rock, which is a famous Australian novel and movie. Iconic places like waterfalls and dams and reservoirs and the seaside, fishermen at Lawn, and these types of themes that she brought into her photography.
At a time when women were not really recognised for their technological abilities, she really was at the forefront of the development of photography in Australia, let alone being a woman.
The female artists tended not to get public recognition. Effie comes to prominence first with a series of booklets that she produces of Victorian wildflowers.
Effie would take a black and white photographic plate of the particular wildflower that she was looking at, and then she would hand colour it. That hand-coloured image would then go through a 3-colour printing process. So this was in the years 1914, 1915, 1916, 1917 that she was making part of her living out of this type of work.
She really makes a name for herself too as a model maker. A big waiting list of people on her books wanting to buy these dolls' houses.
That sounds very old-fashioned now, but in the 1920s and 30s, the press reports suggest that these doll houses were sought after.
We have photographs of her as a young woman working on these little toys. They were often based around a theme of the Australian landscape and Australian native animals.
It's around 1922 when she makes some new friends in Melbourne through the Theosophical Society, and then she gets introduced to the Baha'i religion. And this, of course, totally changes her life.
There was a movement that was big in the early part of the 20th century called the New Thought movement, and the Theosophical Society is a part of that. But New Thought was an aspiration to find new ways of thinking. She was attending lectures in Melbourne looking for new ideas and new inspiration, and she met at one of these meetings this gentleman named Hyde Dunn, and he and his wife had arrived from California in April of 1920 to bring the Baha'i teachings to Australia. He spoke of the need for independent investigation of truth. And this was the line that Effie responded to. She said, I've never thought about that. I was brought up a Christian. Everything I've done was just because that's the way my family was. I haven't thought about this myself. In the years following World War I, there was a lot of questioning of religion. Australia has always been a sectarian society that through the 19th century there was a great divergence between those who were Catholic and those who were Protestant. And it was very important to families at the time. Now, for women like Effie, who had a brother who went to war, and he was psychologically damaged by that, started to question this relationship between the support for war and belonging to a church. How women were involved in the mainstream churches, the most you could do would be to run a fete You know, you could do a fundraiser, but you couldn't have any important office at all.
And I think that would have been one of the great attractions of the Baha'i faith when she first encounters it, that women and men are treated with absolute equality.
Maybe she thought that her life was already on a set path in Melbourne as an artist and a craftswoman, and maybe she thought that's what she'd be doing for the foreseeable future. But that was all overturned by this meeting with the Duns and hearing about the Baha'i teachings. She went up to Haid Dun and she said, I accept what you've said. And she, from that moment, embraced these Baha'i teachings and became very close friends with Clara and Haid Dun.
Not only the first woman in Australia to declare her faith in Baha'u'llah and become a Baha'i, and as such is so highly regarded by the Australian Baha'i community, but she was also a notable person in her own right as a female photographer.
This is a photo of Clara and Haid Dun taken in the Botanical Gardens in Melbourne in 1924, and I'm quite sure that it's Effie's. She was travelling with them at the time, and this became an iconic photo of the couple. Once she decided that she wanted to be a Baha'i, it opened up her worldview to not just think about Victorian Australia and, in fact, not just think about the Western tradition, but to open up the idea that, yes, she's a Westerner, she's an Australian, she's a Victorian, but she's a world citizen. Paint used to have lead, and she had a habit of licking the paintbrush to give it a bit of moisture and to change the colour perhaps, and she got some lead poisoning, and the doctor said, you've got to give up painting.
The doctors suggested a good long rest. A sea voyage would be good for her.
She travelled with Clara and Haid Dun. So the next period in her life is a very active period in 1923 and 1924, where she's travelling with the Duns to Perth, to South Australia, to Hobart, and living with them and assisting them. They're about 15 to 20 years older than her. She took on Clara and Haid Dun as she called her spiritual parents, who introduced her to the Baha'i teachings. In 1924, again, something remarkable happened. She meets Martha Root. Now, Martha Root is a global traveller. She's a journalist by profession, and she had become a Baha'i easily a decade before, and she had started travelling the world. So Effie meets this global traveller who's a Western woman, who's independent, and who's also attached to promoting the Baha'i principles. She travels with Martha Root to New Zealand, to Auckland, and to Wellington. Martha Root was a whirlwind of activity. She showed Effie what it is to, in a very energetic way, reach the public with the Baha'i message. And it was through this meeting with Martha Root that Effie heard of this group of New Zealand Baha'is who'd only known of the Baha'i teaching since late 1922, but they decided to go to Haifa and meet Shoghi Effendi and see the Baha'i holy places there. Shoghi Effendi was the head of the Baha'i faith in the time as a young man in his 20s. And Martha Root said to Effie, well, why don't you go too? And Effie said, okay, I'll go.
And I think it's from that point that photography again will become very important for her.
And she immediately accepted, but she thought she was going on a 3-month trip. The plan was to visit Haifa and see the Baha'i holy sites, and that's called a pilgrimage. Then she intended to go to England to see the mother country, as it was a common thing to take, take a pilgrimage back to the mother country and learn about where Australian society had some of its origins. And then she intended to come back to Australia. Now, the boat trip over was quite enjoyable. She made many friends. When you travel on these boats that take many weeks to go across the sea, they would have a daily newspaper. And she managed to put something in there about her toys for Australian children, etc.
No doubt her grandfather would have told her about his seafaring days and his adventures as a sailor. It's interesting thinking of Effie then taking off on this long sea voyage herself from New Zealand to go over to the Middle East.
I think that Effie is remarkable in a number of different dimensions. One is her interest in technical matters. She's interested in science, she's interested in the scientific aspects of light, she's interested in geography. And when I say interested in geography, she's interested in distances between locations and the time that it takes her to travel there, so that when she does travel by boat, to Port Said in Egypt on her way to Palestine, she takes a note of how far in nautical miles they travel each day. Another distraction took the form of 7 islands of coral fringed by narrow reefs known as the Brothers. The most northern island stood, Effie noted, just 33 feet high and a quarter mile long, and the most southern one a mere 20 feet high and 200 feet long. Abnormal refraction, she observed, had at times allowed the islands to be sighted at a distance of 100 miles. Now, what sort of woman is writing this sort of thing in a diary? She was very good with the pen. She was very descriptive. She could narrate in a way that you could imagine her travels, whether she's passing through, as it was called, Ceylon, Colombo, and she would describe what it was like to be on the boat on a journey to Palestine. But by being in Haifa, Effie was able to literally speak with members of the family of the central figures, particularly the daughters of Abdul Baha, who she spent a lot of time with. And they would tell her stories of what happened in Persia, what happened during exiles of the family. So Effie was able to write these stories down and send them back to the Australian Baha'is. She says, "The household is an industrious beehive of the great work, splendid division of labour, but with all-pervading unity of heart. Never have I seen the necessary subordinations of organised service so full of a sense of dignity and essential quality as here. I thought that in the spirit of such devoted cooperation and cheerful self-subordination, there was the potential solution to those great problems of class and caste which today so affect society." Everything she'd sort of heard about from the Duns, and she goes to Haifa and she sees it in Shoghi Effendi's family, the descendants of Baha'u'llah. In a few moments, Shoghi Effendi came to greet us. His step was quick and decisive, also his manner of speech. But the sweetness of his countenance and the bright, alert expression of his eyes conveys to you a wonderful tenderness of heart, which radiated to you such graciousness and simplicity. You felt at once at your ease, as if a weight had been removed from your breast, and a great peace reigned. It was a wonderful interview, never to be forgotten. When she was leaving Haifa to go to England, some of the members of Shoghi Effendi's family said to Effie, "Look, when you're finished in England, can you come back and visit us again?" And she said, "Okay, I'll do that." Again, this intuitive, sort of spontaneous, nothing holding her back, just changed her ticket and went back. And when she got back, Shoghi Effendi was out of town. He was travelling. And then the family said, "Wait till he comes back." And she said, "Okay, well, I'll wait a few weeks." And so eventually he came back. And then the family asked Shoghi Effendi, said, "Effie has been such a help to us, so many practical ways she's helped us here. Is it possible that she can stay even longer?" Shoghi Effendi had this conversation with Effie, and he said, I think you really should go back and spend time with Claire and Hyde Dunn, and, there's a lot of work to do in Australia. And besides, he said, a general always keeps his troublesome troops near him, but he sends the good generals a long way away, implying he was going to send her away because he could trust her. And the next day, he said to her, "Effie, I've reconsidered. I'd like you to stay." And she said, "Oh, obviously, Shoghi Effendi, I'm one of the troublesome troops that you need to keep an eye on." So they had a good laugh about that. It was an open-ended stay.
And he is very impressed by her knowledge of photography and also her model-making skills. She made models of the landscape to help develop the gardens around this new hostel that was being built for Western visitors.
Many pilgrims came from the east, speaking Farsi or Arabic or other languages coming from India, Iran. But there were pilgrims coming from the West, and they literally needed different care, different maybe ways of being comfortable in their quarters, different food. This was the 1920s. And so Effie was able to do this. And so for 11 years, she was the hostess at the Western Pilgrim House in Haifa. That was her main role. In that very year, 1925, he had in mind to establish what he called the Baha'i Yearbook, not only for the Baha'i community worldwide, but also for the Baha'is to present to people in government or others in authority to explain what was happening. And it's quite prescient, I think, that there's a photo of Effie in the very first one. It says, "Miss Effie Baker of Melbourne, Australia, who travelled with Miss Martha Root, Baha'i teacher and lecturer, on her notable trip throughout that country. Effie at this stage is really merely a hostess of a pilgrim house, and yet she had such an impact on Shoghi Effendi and the editors of this yearbook that they put a photo in. I say it's prescient because it was a harbinger of things to come, because in later years, Effie's photos populated the yearbook through the 30s, 40s, into the 50s and beyond. Mount Carmel is one of those famous mountains that's referred to in the Old Testament, and there she was living at the foot of this holy mountain, in a sense. It's tied to all the prophetic religions. And she had the task of capturing in her photographs the progressive beautification of the Baha'i land there. And she would have never have dreamed that her art would take her to that role. In one way you could say that taking a photo of a mountain that's covered with rocks and crags is a very difficult thing to make look interesting. And yet we can look at her early photos of the panorama of Mount Carmel, and there's a visual interest there that she somehow manages to capture, which is quite extraordinary, I think. She had a sense of what I call fidelity. I think that's why Shoghi Effendi was happy to keep her in Haifa, because he had the sense that in Effie he found somebody who her word was true. Shoghi Effendi, as head of the Baha'i faith in the 1920s, he wanted to bring this story to the West. It was known in the East, but he wanted to make a translation of a book, and he wanted it published in the West. The Dawnbreakers is a book of history. It's one man's effort. His name was Nabil Zarandi, and it was his effort to bring together the story, because he realised in his time that these stories hadn't been brought together, so he reached out to people to get the stories. The significance of this book is that it records the early history of the Baha'i faith, commencing in the 1840s with a series of tumultuous events surrounding the prophetic figure of the Bab and his followers, the way they were treated by the clergy at the time and by the government leaders, the Shahs, their expulsion from the country. But in the midst of all that, the emergence of Baha'u'llah as a prophetic figure who followed the Bab and established the Baha'i faith. Many sites throughout Persia, to the north and the south and the centre, where these historic events took place, had not been recorded through photographs, nor the many relics. By relics we mean the garments worn by these early figures, pens they used, anything that was a remembrance of them that could give some way of attaching understanding to their life and their fate. Shoghi Effendi had been asking the Baha'is in Persia to send these photographs for some time, but they had been very slow to arrive. There were a number of reasons for that. There were simply not many competent photographers in the country. But secondly, photography was quite a dangerous occupation, because at the time the authorities were very nervous of foreign espionage. And indeed, to be fair to them, there was a lot of foreign espionage taking place. At the time, Persia wasn't a strong country, and it was subject to spheres of influence by the Western powers. And there were literally people travelling through under the guise of being a geographer or a geologist or a botanist who was taking photos, but in fact they were gathering intelligence. And of course that intelligence would have helped those various powers when it came to the Second World War. Shoghi Effendi knew her photographic abilities, and he said, "Effie, can you go to Persia for me? I need all of these sites to be photographed, and here's a list." But of course that was also controversial in the eyes of many who didn't understand the origins of the Baha'i faith or its purposes. And if they had known that Effie was travelling amongst them for that purpose, her life would have been endangered. The dangers were multiple. It was not just because of her Baha'i mission. It was because she was, in the eyes of many, a foreigner and an infidel, and she wasn't Muslim. And so in 1930, she went. They thought it would take 3 months. It took about 8 to 9 months in the end, because she wouldn't leave until she had everything on that list. She took 2 cameras, some film and some glass plate. When she had relics, she realised that the Kodak camera wasn't the right one for that. Kodak was for the wide. And then when Shoghi Effendi said, "Take the relics as well," she said, "Oh, I'll need to take a second camera." and that was the glass plate camera. So she had to take a second trip down to the only photographic shop in Haifa, and Shoghi Effendi said, buy everything they've got. Buy all the stock.
Effie Baker was one of the original archivists, so it's interesting to see her work, because as an archivist, she was both preserving the history and also making it at the same time. By creating these photographs, she was contributing to the archives and also building memories for the future generations so they could see what was done in the past, what things looked like, and the quality. She managed to capture all the details, the emotion, the lighting, everything. She managed to capture it in those photographs. So we can now see what she saw.
Some of these sites were so remote, there were no roads yet. Certainly for the north of Iran, she says in her memoir that she was the first these people say, you're the first European to come to our village. My car with punctured tyre on way to village of Seysan. So she's obviously left the car, she's taken a camera with her, and then the villagers hear that they're nearly there and they've run out. And so she's called this East Greets West. And this is a village woman who's coming out to meet her. But to get there, in some cases, she was going by donkey. And those donkeys and horses that she used, they would have saddlebags, and they would be going over mountainous treks. Here you see Effie with her horse, and you can see the paths that they went over. And there were times where she was thrown off a donkey, landed on the ground, and went on with a sore shoulder for days at a time until it healed itself. Now, she explains that at each site, she would take 3 exposures and develop those so that she would have a choice of exposures to see which one was the best. And at the end of her trip, she left a whole series of those with the Baha'is in Tehran, and she sent by post a set to Haifa, and then she carried a set herself because she realized there was not going to be a chance to go back. We have Effie's original passport in this archive, and there's Effie's photo there, and she obviously needed this passport to make this trip. On one time when she was leaving the gates of Tehran, which is the capital city of Persia, she was stopped by the guards, and he said, "Where do you come from?" She said, "I come from Australia." And he said, "Where Australia?" She said, "About 4,000 farsakhs." And she thinks that a farsakh was about 3.5 miles. She'd made a calculation of that. He put his cap on and he said, "What subject?" And she said, "Australia belonged to King George of England, and I'm a British subject." And she said, and he was quite satisfied with that, and he gave the command, "Burro," which is go. There are other times when she had more difficult passage, particularly as she was returning out of Persia, and she had all her photographic equipment and a set of the photographs, and some guards not in Persia but on the Iraq side, which was a British colony or mandate at the time under the League of Nations, and they attempted to extract some money out of her to be able to get her bags, and she said no. She said, "I'm not going to do that. There's nothing that is taxable in there. It's all my personal effects." And they said, "Oh, well, we're going to take these bags to our main headquarters." She said, "Fine, I'll meet you there." And by chance, there was somebody at that main headquarters who said, "Well, what are you doing here?" She said, "Well, these gentlemen are trying to get something from me because of my bags." And he said, "Oh, we'll fix that." And he talked to the head person in customs, and it was cleared because there was nothing taxable in there. There were no new goods, there was no commercial goods, and she was free to go. So that's an example of how she stood her ground. She only stood, in the old terms, 5'3". She's not a very tall person. She was quite miniature in stature, but she was bold and audacious in everything she did. Amongst the many significant, and there are hundreds of photographs in this book, but I'm choosing one which is the barracks in Tabriz, the site of the martyrdom of the Bab in 1850. And this is a barracks square, and there's an X that she's put on the photograph, and that is apparently the spot at which the Bab was hung up by rope and executed by firing squad. And she records in her memoir, she says, "Sunday morning I met the chief of police, and he invited me to visit him at his office in the square where the Bab was shot. Saw the spot where he was killed. Most of the buildings have been razed to the ground for more modern ones to be erected. except for the portion where they suspended and shot him. This had been retained for a temporary prison kitchen until the more modern was finished. So I'm pretty sure that this no longer exists, and that's an example. And there are many other photos in this book that are an example of capturing a historic image that no longer exists. We owe it to Effie for making that effort. So she's really at the heart of things, and she didn't design to be there. It was just through this desire to serve and that recognition by others that she had these capacities to serve, and she was very privileged to be in these positions. Shoghi Effendi's intent for this book was to inspire the Baha'is in the West. He said, this is what the Baha'is in Persia have gone through at the beginning of their faith. And the Western Baha'is weren't aware of that in detail. This book gave the detail, and it would inspire them to take the Baha'i message through, for example, through the Americas, through North America, Central America, South America, and eventually to other parts of the world. So it's a book of inspiration, but based on these stories of heroism of the early Baha'is. By being published in the Dawnbreakers, it creates a lasting testament to her work and her service. Just a 9-month period of travel, and yet, in a sense, an everlasting legacy of having these photos available to the world. She was a content person. She knew that she had performed well in her life. She had served her family. She had served her community, and she had a real sense of joy, which is quite moving to see somebody in their later years who you get the sense that she felt satisfied with what she'd achieved.